National Bank of Chicago, one of the major banks in those days in the Rockefeller orbit. And now we have to say that there were two big financial orbits at this point, the Morgans and the Rockefellers, both of whom were in favor of central banking by this point. Okay. He was also president of the American Bankers Association, Gage. After he left the Treasury Department, after a couple of years, he becomes president of the U.S. Trust Company, which was Rockefeller-controlled, and has handpicked assistant of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, who one of the major figures in creating the Federal Reserve System, goes on to become a top executive of the Rockefeller flagship bank of that period, the National City Bank of New York. He was appointed at the Treasury not because his name was plucked out of a hat, but because Mark Hanna, his close friend and political mastermind and financial backer of President McKinley, chairman of the Ohio Republican Party and then the National Republican Party, coal magnate and iron manufacturer, Hanna, was also a close business associate of and an old friend and high school classmate of John D. Rockefeller Sr. So when you begin to realize that, you begin to realize it's not an accident. These things are not, it's not that Hanna somehow has a theory and the thing just, it works somehow by a random selection of people. Okay, Leslie Shaw, who was the next Secretary of Treasury I mentioned, who was under Theodore Roosevelt, was a small-town Iowa banker who became governor of his state. He continued as president of a bank while he was governor. In those days, it was not none of this nonsense about blind trust or worry about conflict of interest. And he was the friend and ally of the so-called Des Moines Regency, which was running the Iowa Republican Party for many years. And the head of the Iowa Regency, Senator Allison, was in turn tied closely to Charles Perkins, who was a close Morgan ally and president of the Morgan-controlled Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. Okay, after the failure of these two attempts by Gage and Shaw to use the Treasury as a fulcrum of a central bank, comes the Panic of 1907. It was at that point when the large bankers decided we needed no more fooling around, fellas. We need a central bank. But even before the Panic of 1907, the drive for a central bank was launched officially by Jacob Schiff, who was head of the powerful investment banking firm of Kuhn Loeb & Company, who urged the New York Chamber of Commerce to advocate fundamental banking reforms. This is January 1906. Okay? And the New York Commerce immediately established a special committee to investigate the problem, comprised of leaders from commercial investment banking, including Isidore Straus of R.H. Macy's, who was a close friend of Schiff, and Frank Vanderlip, I've already mentioned, whose name pops up constantly, of the National City Bank. In March, the special committee, unsurprisingly, by the way, all of you who know about committees in general know that the committees decide nothing. It's all decided ahead of time. The committee ratifies it. The special committee reports, yes, we need a central bank, and as they put it, we need a strong central bank, quote, similar to the Bank of Germany, unquote, which was the role model for them. Well, the New York Chamber was kind of reluctant. This is kind of radical for them. They didn't endorse it. But the big bankers took up the cry, and in mid-1906, the American Bankers Association named a commission of inquiry of leading bankers to study the question, and the report again calls for radical changes and more or less of a central bank. By that time, after the Panic of 1907, as I say, then they realized, boy, we really need a central bank. We have to get going on this. And one of the things that were passed during the Panic of 1907 was the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which provided for the issuance of so-called emergency currency by groups of bankers clustered in national currency associations. It was a regional cartel scheme for each region, but it was supposed to be a stopgap for the emergency, but the emergency was 7 years, which is a hell of a long emergency period, during which they could issue these notes. However, Aldrich-Vreeland really wasn't used. It was only used once. And the main thing that came out of the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908 was the setting up of a National Monetary Commission by the Aldrich-Vreeland Act to study the American and foreign banking systems and emerge with a plan for reform. The commission consisted of 9 senators and 9 representatives, as the usual kind of government commission. And the standard bureaucratic procedure, the chairman was Senator Aldrich, who passed the act, and the vice chairman was Representative Vreeland, who was the other co-sponsor. Well, Vreeland is unimportant. He was a Buffalo banker, and we need say no more about him. Aldrich is a person of a different stamp. extremely powerful senator from Rhode Island, Republican senator, who made millions during his long service in the U.S. Senate. It's not quite known exactly how he did it. He started off as a fairly humble grocer, and he winds up after 30 years in the Senate as a multimillionaire, which those days meant multi-million. I mean, million meant a lot then. Aldrich, again, it's not an accident. He was one of the prime movers in the creation of the Federal Reserve System. He was also the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and may be fairly said, I think, to be Rockefeller's person, his man in the U.S. Senate. It was from Nelson Aldrich, our beloved governor of New York. I come from New York. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller took his first two names. Okay, from the inception of this National Monetary Commission until the Aldrich plan was presented to Congress 4 years later. It was 1909 and 1913. Aldrich and the Commission were a vital key in the drive for a central bank. Particularly influential in the deliberations of the Commission were two men who were not official members. This often happens, of course. Most of the senators and congressmen rarely showed up at the sessions. Aldrich asked J.P. Morgan to recommend a banking expert. Who else? Who better than Morgan to recommend an expert? And he recommended very happily responded with Henry P. Davison, a Morgan partner, and George Reynolds, who was president of the American Bankers Association. You have to realize the way the Morgans worked in that period. Investment banks are partnerships and not corporations. I think it's still true. And the Morgan firm assigned several partners to be their political arms, so to speak. They're people in politics. And Henry Davison was one of them. Another was George W. Perkins, who winds up as head of the Progressive Party of America, and a bunch of others, Thomas W. Lamont, et cetera, et cetera. So that was one big focus, the Aldrich-Rockefeller connection, and now Morgan coming in with a Morgan partner as a key person here. Another prime foco for the drive for central bank was Paul Moritz Warburg, who was the scion of the great international banking family, a German banking firm of M.M. Warburg and Company of Hamburg, who emigrates to the United States in 1902 to become a partner in the influential banking house of Kuhn-Loeb and Company. What you have to realize about Warburg is he spent all of his time, apparently his full time, not in investment banking, but in pushing the idea of a central bank, in print and in lectures and all that sort of stuff. He was being paid, I think, about $600,000 a year, which meant about, I don't know what it is now, $6 million or something like that, more than that, just for the purpose of propagandizing for a central bank. Okay. He was sensitive to the idea that the public didn't like central banks, didn't like central control, was suspicious of Wall Street, and so forth. And you then had a certain amount of jockeying for power and influence on the part of, or specifics on the part of the various pro-central bankers. They had to work out a whole bunch of things here. And they had to work out the provisions, they had to work out the general situation. Interestingly enough, Aldrich, the politician, wanted a straight central bank. That's it, the Bank of the United States, whatever, and period. And Warburg, the banker, said, no, the American public won't accept this. We needed phony decentralization. We needed the idea of regional banks with the Federal Reserve Board, which would be only supervise it, because the public won't accept a straight, outright centralization. We need the content of centralization with a form of decentralization. So, which of course, is the thing that eventually happens. In order to finally iron out their differences in November, I think 1910, I think it was, the top pro-central banking people met in a famous secret meeting, a clandestine meeting. It's famous now, at Jekyll Island, Georgia, the Jekyll Island Club of Jekyll Island, Georgia, which was a duck shooting retreat. And there was a big secrecy involved because the press was all interested in the activities of all these people, and they told the press, no, we're taking a special railroad, chartering a special railroad car, and going down to Georgia for duck shooting. We're not going to talk about anything specific, anything economic. And they all travel under assumed names in this railroad car, which Aldrich chartered, and somehow they managed to talk the press out of publicizing this. And don't investigate this too. I don't know how they did it, but somehow transactions occurred, gentle persuasion occurred, and nothing was mentioned of it at the time. Okay, so they met for about a week at Jekyll Island. The people who met symbolized the power elite involved in pushing for the Federal Reserve System. Senator Aldrich was there, of course. He had chartered the